Today you become a 19th-century Tuareg caravan master. At 8, my grandfather draped my first indigo Tagelmust veil onto me in Tamanrasset, and at 52 I passed that very same veil down to my grandson on the day the French sealed every last well. In the year 1858, I was born inside a black goatskin tent at the foot of the Hoggar Mountains in Tamanrasset, and my grandfather carried me outside the tent so I could open my eyes for the first time upon the desert stars. My father was the finest caravan master of our tribe. Every single journey down the Bilma Salt Road took him 6 full months at the saddle, and he returned with the backs of his camels piled high with cut salt slabs and elephant ivory. My mother sat all day before the tent twisting camel hair fibers into long ropes on her thigh. She always said it took 1 full month of twisting before any salt merchant would dare entrust his slabs to a single rope she had made. At 5, my grandfather lifted me for the first time onto the back of a dromedary kneeling on the warm sand, and he told me that this single-humped camel was the very life of all of us Tuareg people of the desert. At 6, I began learning the names of the stars with my grandfather, and he told me that Polaris and Sirius and the constellation Taurus were the 3 most vital stars for any caravan merchant who hoped to live in the Sand Sea. At 7, my grandfather traded one of his goats for a single bolt of deep indigo-dyed cotton cloth, and he told me that when I turned 8, he would cut from that bolt the first indigo Tagelmust face veil of my entire life. At 8, my grandfather draped my first deep indigo Tagelmust face veil onto me at the threshold of our tent in Tamanrasset, and in that single instant every grown man of the tribe bowed his head and called me a true Tuareg. At 9, my grandfather began teaching me Arabic and Hausa beyond our own Tamashek mother tongue, and he told me that no caravan merchant who lacked 3 trade tongues should ever hope to return home alive across the deep desert. At 10, my grandfather let me ride my own dromedary alone out beyond the date palm fringe of the Tamanrasset oasis, and he told me that from this single day onward the desert itself was the one book I had to learn to read. At 11, I had learned to read the long sand ridges of the Tuareg, and the spine of any northwest dune always pointed straight toward the Harmattan wind blowing in from the distant Raytama grass plains far beyond our reach. At 12, I traveled beyond the Hoggar Mountains for the first time with my own father, and he made me lie flat across the camel saddle so I could feel through my own chest the hidden water vein flowing beneath the deep desert sand. At 13, I had learned to read the hoof prints of passing camels, and the simple depth of any fresh print would tell me how many full days of journey that single passing caravan still had ahead of it through the burning Tuareg. At 14, I walked the entire Bilma Salt Road with my father for the very first time, and across those 6 full months at the saddle, we crossed 4 separate stretches of the waterless Tainsrouth Sand Sea of Death. At 15, I cut the very first rock salt slab of my life from the open salt pan of Bilma, and that single slab stood half as tall as a grown man, and it took 3 full camels working together to carry it back north. At 16, my grandfather hung the silver Kel Tamashek cross pendant of our family upon my chest before the tent, and he told me that this single ornament was the very mark only the chosen heir of an Aminical could ever wear. At 17, I married the village girl Amelil, who dyed the finest indigo cotton of any woman among us, and she hung inside our wedding tent the very first bolt of fresh deep indigo blue cloth her own 2 hands had ever dyed. At 18, I began leading a small caravan of my own south down to Agadez, and on the very first trip alone, I traded 10 cut salt slabs for a single pouch of pure Timbuktu gold dust at the Hausa mud brick city gate. At 20, my own father caught a fever along the road to Bilma and never returned home, and the entire tribe burned a sacred bonfire before the tent for 7 full nights to send his soul back home to the Hoggar Mountains. At 21, the elders of the tribe pressed my father's silver-handled riding whip into my own 2 hands, and from that single day onward, every Tuareg of the Hoggar foothills called me Aminical, the chosen caravan king. At 22, I personally assembled a great caravan of 4,000 dromedaries at Tamanrasset, intending to walk the Bilma Salt Road and then descend south to Timbuktu to trade pure salt slabs for gold dust and kola nuts. On the 20th day at the saddle, we entered the Thames-Rauft waterless sea, and for 12 full days not a single drop of oasis water touched our lips, and the entire caravan survived only on the fresh milk of our nursing camels. On the 40th day, we reached the open salt pan of Bilma, and across one full month of hard labor, the 4,000 camels of my caravan were at last fully laden with the freshly cut white rock salt slabs of the pan. On the 80th day, we arrived at the mud brick gate of Agadez, and the house of merchants of the city crowded around me, eager to trade 10 heavy leather pouches of gold dust for a single camel load of cut Bilma salt slabs. On the 120th day, we finally arrived at Timbuktu, and every Songhai nobleman along the south bank of the Niger River came out beyond the sandstone gate to welcome my great caravan into the trading city. At 24 in Timbuktu, I met before the Sankor Mosque mud minaret a single Wanyera gold merchant from the south, and he promised to deliver to me 2 heavy leather pouches of pure gold dust every single year for the rest of my life. At 25, I returned home to Tamanrasset at last, and my wife Amel had borne me a son in my absence, and she had stood patiently at the threshold of our tent waiting with the child in her arms for a full year. At 27, on my second journey south to Timbuktu, I encountered an armed splinter band of the Kel Ahagar Tuareg upon a high dune ridge, and they violently took from me half of the loaded salt slabs of my caravan. The night I returned home to Tamanrasset, I knelt before the tent at twilight and carved every one of the 12 stolen paddler names one by one into a single tall red Hagar volcanic memorial stone raised at the camp. At 29, I began passing the family silver whip and the holy star map of our line by word of mouth to 12 carefully chosen young caravan apprentices that I had selected from among the youth of our own tribe. At 30, I began to plan a far longer westward journey down the Tudeni Salt Road and then south into Mauritania, a single full route that lay 2 full months further out beyond the Bilma Salt Road we already knew well. At 32, I walked the entire route to the Tudeni salt pan for the very first time, and the rock salt slabs cut there were even harder and even wider than those of Bilma and loaded by the heavy cart onto our camels. At 33, I led my entire great caravan all the way to the Atlantic surf line at Nouakchott, and at that shore my dromedaries for the very first time in their lives tasted the salty, brackish sea water of the western coast. At 34, the scholars of the Sankor Mosque Library in Timbuktu presented me with a single hand-copied Kufic script Quran scroll, and I personally hid that holy manuscript inside the tent until the very last day of my life. At 35, every caravan merchant across the heart of the Sahara was calling me the king of the blue veil, and the tribal children of the Hagar foothills all bowed their heads and stepped aside whenever they saw me pass. At 36, word arrived from the far north that a French expedition under Colonel Flatters was riding south out of Algiers with armed troops to survey a single railroad line clear across the entire central Sahara Desert. At 37, our Kel Ahagar Tuareg kinsmen ambushed the entire Flatters expedition at the Well of Amadrar in the deep desert, and they killed every single one of those 94 armed Frenchmen down to the last man. At 38, in fierce retaliation, the French began to push southward in earnest, and beside every single oasis, while that our trade caravans had ever passed through, they began erecting heavy stone colonial gun forts. At 40, the French sealed the entire northern trade route from Wargla down to Tamanrasset, and that single year was the first year of my entire life when I had failed to complete the full Bilma Salt Road journey. At 42, my eldest son, on his way down to Agadez to trade for grain, was killed by a French light cavalry patrol on the desert road, and that year he was just 18 and had only just finished learning the Salt Road. At 43, I carved my own dead son's name into the red Hagar volcanic memorial stone before the tent, and across the full face of that single stone I had already carved more than 50 names of my own kin. At 45, French Captain Laperrine led his Meharist camel cavalry south and formally seized the oasis of Tamanrasset itself, and all the grown men of our tribe withdrew deep into the high Hagar mountains to fight on. At 46, the French colonial authority formally outlawed every single trans-Saharan caravan along the Bilma Salt Road, and I personally buried the final 500 rock salt slabs of my family deep beneath the dune sand. At 48, my wife Amelo passed quietly away the very night she finished dyeing the 100th bolt of indigo blue cloth of her life, and that final bolt of indigo I could never bring myself to sell to any other soul. At 49, my daughter gave birth to a baby boy on the red sand outside the tent, and she knelt down before me and placed that newborn child into my own arms, saying, "Please, grandfather, give him a name of your own." At 50, I carried my grandson down to the same stretch of red tamanrasset sand my own grandfather had once carried me to, and I let him open his eyes for the very first time on the Polaris North Star burning above us. At 51, I unrolled once more for my grandson the worn camel hide star map my own grandfather had once unrolled for me, telling him that a true caravan merchant must always tell Polaris apart from the Dog Star Sirius. In the autumn of 51, I personally washed clean the oldest indigo Tagelmust face veil my grandfather had ever handed down to me, and I hung it out to dry once more on the acacia branch before our tent in the wind. At 52, the French colonial garrison sealed the very last open water well of Tamanrasset itself, and on that single pre-dawn morning, I draped my grandfather's ancient indigo Tagelmust face veil upon the shoulders of my grandson. This was the life of a 19th-century Tuareg caravan master. If you have ever given yourself entirely over to a stretch of sand sea, leave a comment. Next episode, pick A Viking raider, or B, a Byzantine eunuch. Vote in the comments. This is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only.